This is Clayton Vance. Welcome to episode 2 of our Introduction to Timelessness course for residential design. In the last episode, what we talked about were the fundamental underlying principles that generate timeless architecture. Today, we're going to be discussing style. We live in a world without style. It's essentially just a blue jeans world. It started in the 1950s and it's continued, and we haven't been able to figure out how to get style back. So why was it that everything prior to 1920 you could distinguish and actually categorize into just Victorian and Spanish Revival and Colonial and all these different things? Is because they actually had certain elements that collectively generated a collective language of architecture for different styles. And we're going to discuss some of those today. But before we get into that, what we want to understand is what are even more fundamental principles than that, and how did we actually get here? So let's begin this journey. So if we go back in history, a real quick history lesson, late 19th century, there was something called the Beaux-Arts Academy, which taught architecture and art in Paris. And that's where you went if you wanted a classical education, a real traditional education. And the Paris that we know today was a function and a result of that particular pedagogical style and school. Now, simultaneously to this, you had the Impressionist movement going on, Monet, Van Gogh, and that whole genre. These were two polar opposites of a pendulum swing that was finally about to collapse at the late 19th century. The same thing happened in architecture. We had tons of ornament, just decoration upon decoration upon decoration. When you look at some of those early mansions, even in the US with the Vanderbilts over in Newport, Rhode Island, and that type of stuff. So then you had these very vernacular buildings stylistically over in the Western US. But what happened is there was a movement called the modernist movement. And they said, get rid of ornament, styles are a lie, it's all just fake, it's all just facade, we don't want any part of it. We want authentic, real architecture. And what is that? It is form follows function. And all of the actual engineering stuff, that's what we really need. It became an engineering aesthetic. And that's what happened to style, is we went from super fluff, the Victorian, high Victorian age, to super minimalism. So here's the question you need to answer for yourselves. What happens when you completely lose and reject all of the traditions and principles of those traditions that generated the world in which you live? If you completely reject them and you're inventing stuff out of nowhere from scratch on your own. Well, that's the place we found ourselves. Because I'm willing to bet if you're listening to this course, one of the things you want to learn is, hey, how do we actually make timeless homes? What I want to do is describe for you right now one of the things and the reasons why we end up with the world in which we live. Because what will happen when you start looking at home design, for instance, everyone wonders, it's like, hey, why do the homes just always have this a-stylistic look, or they don't really look like their style? It's because it's a form follows function attitude. It's a plan out design. And it was through the treatises that existed that like, hey, plan first, outside second. And so what'll happen is you'll have a house that will do a bubble diagram where you have an entry, you have a garage, you have a this, you have a mudroom, you have an office, you have a... And anyway, what'll happen is as you begin to do the outline of this particular house, you'll have these weird jogs, ins and outs of a house once you get beyond the overall just box split level, which was the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And then you look at this thing that I drew right here. How on earth do you roof this, right? And this is why a plan that looks essentially like this turns into a house that looks like this. We have all of these ups, and they keep going, and we have a big garage on this side, and it comes down, and then we have this big oversized entry in the middle because we're trying to create visual interest. And it's like, is it French? Is it what? And so then what we do in our world that we live in today is, it doesn't really look like anything stylistically, so let's put some stuff on it to make it look like a Craftsman, even though it looks nothing like a Craftsman. Then all of a sudden we put a tapered column and a big tapered column like that, and then a gable rather than that little arch, and all of a sudden, now it's a Craftsman. And we do that. Why do we do that? Because we're looking at certain elemental pieces of things like the words that make up a poem. And we're taking some of these words that are the critical parts and pieces of that particular poem, and we're embedding them to some other poem and saying, well, now it's that poem. When all reality, it's not. It's just taking some certain aspects of it. And so what we want to discuss here are the fundamental principles that are generators of style. And so here is where we are now in today's world. And this is why every single house seems to look the same way when you're especially doing custom homes. You're designing from an inside out rather than a stylistic outside in approach. And that would be my first recommendation, is you never start with the floor plan. You actually start stylistically with what you're going for, and then you back into the actual floor plan. However, in that context, you have to have a critical understanding of all of the programmatic requirements so that you can actually put, while you're designing the outside of the home, all the stuff in the right spots. Because if you don't actually have an idea that this person wants an office, a kitchen, a pantry, X big, you go down the list of things, you won't exactly know how big each of those rooms need to be. So to have a fundamental understanding of the sizes and shapes of rooms, how most effectively and efficiently to use them, and how to employ them within a floor plan from an outside-in perspective becomes a primary, determining success factor for your personal success when trying to execute home plans. Now, let's look at the fundamental principles that we want to talk about when it comes to generating style and looking at style. So we're going to cover 3 particular principles in this episode. Number 1, modern to traditional. What does that look like? Number 2, massing and how that affects style. And number 3, some of the details that actually become the language of what a style is made of. So let's start with the continuum of modern to traditional. And everyone will fall on the continuum somewhere. Though it is actually kind of funny, because most of the time when I interview couples, most of the time the man is sitting on the modern side and the woman is sitting on the traditional side. The man's like, dude, I want something cool. And the woman's like, hey, I want something cottagey and really cute. That's just a generalization, but it happens quite frequently. So on this continuum, what we have is we have modern on this side. We have transitional in the middle. And what on earth does that mean? You've heard the word before. And then we have traditional on the outside of it. The way I would begin to describe each of these things is if I were to have the exact same form. Now go with me here and watch what I'm about to do. If we have the exact same form, what is that and how is that articulated? So if I have a traditional house, let's have like old school Western Pioneer era house. We have a little gable on the front, and then we have a cross gable roof plan would look something like this, with a cross gable here, goes like that. And then maybe there's a porch or something down here on the side. And we have a little door back in here with a window or something. And we have a couple dormers with windows right here. And that becomes just a nice little window on the top and maybe a small bay right there. And this, with the details and how this begins to get articulated right here, that becomes a very traditionally styled home. It has proportions of traditional languages of architecture. It's got the details, and that would be a traditional style house. Now, how do you turn the exact same form? I'm going to start with that gable on the front with the little cross gable. How do you turn this into a transitional styled house? Really what happens is we're making more clean lines. And everyone's heard of that. I want clean lines. I don't want all the fluff of the tradition. And also larger windows. When you look at traditionally styled architecture, one of the reasons that it looks the way it does is because you couldn't span openings further than natural materials allowed you to span the opening. Therefore, you ended up with limited opening widths. And so that made all of the openings vertically oriented rather than horizontally oriented. However, because of new construction technologies, we can make openings at, essentially almost any size we want to. And so once you get into transitional, what ends up happening is we are making our windows a lot larger with a lot more light, and we're dividing things up from floor to floor with like metal panels and other things, and then beginning to just have a lot more glass and a lot more engineered materials, not natural materials. And so transitional would be something like this, where you'd have just big giant windows rather than broken up into all these little windows, big shed dormer or something that just lets in a lot more light. and you're going to have a lot cleaner eaves without all of the fluff that comes with traditional architecture. And so that would be transitional. Larger openings, elimination of details. Modern, if I go with the exact same thing, what we're doing now is we're essentially just eliminating the traditional sense of order. Even if I start with the exact same thing, what would modern look like in the exact same form? Essentially what we'd be doing is, all right, let's put the window on the corner, dematerialize the corner so it no longer looks structurally load-bearing, and let's begin to play with some different types of openings, opening styles, massing forms, and elongated openings, more horizontally oriented rather than vertically oriented, and all sorts of random stuff. So modern is pretty much anything goes, and we'd probably put a big giant flat roof or something somewhere on this, and big window in the flat roof. So anyway, this is what I'm talking about. That's a stupid looking house. I can do modern a lot better than that. But anyway, for purposes of argument right now, in terms of being able to explain modern, traditional, and transitional, and how they go, what we're talking about is very clear order in the traditional one, with very clear details and very clear massing based on traditional languages of architecture. When it comes to transitional, what we're talking about, getting rid of those articulations of detail, making them cleaner, and opening up the windows. Modern, get rid of the order. Just put windows wherever the form follows the function. And regardless of the form that you have, you'd probably typically erase this, but that is the most important thing to understand when you are looking at your own home. If you want to build, if you're a developer, if you're a designer, is where do we want to be on the spectrum? Now, you got to understand, and I think it's been proven over and over and over again, that the traditional stuff will be more timeless in the end if you do it right. If you get the proportions wrong, if you get the details wrong, if you get some fundamental aspects to the thing wrong, it's not going to be as timeless. Transitional also can be timeless. Modern is just going to be trendy. What you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to sell houses fast because they're cool, but in about 15 years, everyone's going to be like, hey, that was built in the XYZ year. And it'd be super trendy, and you're just chasing trends. Is there anything wrong with that? You make the call yourself. And as we begin to look at the second principle, which is massing, the way it manifests itself in different residential historic styles and also modern styles is it determines or is determined by the steepness of the roof, the volume size. There's all sorts of aspects within style that have to do with massing that in all reality we have a difficult time paying attention to because we don't understand how critical they are. For instance, if you think about an arts and crafts house or a bungalow, early 1920s, think about the pitch of the roof on that thing. It's actually pretty shallow. And so they're low slung, shallow pitched roofs, wide porches, tapered columns, some of the details, and very low key. They almost historically look like what we'd call an Etruscan temple or a temple front. Now, if we look at another style, Colonial, it's just anything within that realm, Georgian, Adam, Federal, Greek Revival, any of those things, typically going to be two-story, typically bilaterally symmetrical, with a fairly reasonably steep roof, with a reasonably steep roof pitch on the top of it. Okay, if we look at Victorian, what happened there? Everyone started going just a little bit crazy with their overall massing. In plan, what you'll see is you'll have all of these different things going in and out, and that is where we all went wrong. I'm not saying that it's not pretty. It's my wife's least favorite style, but in this Victorian era, what you have is these turrets that begin to pop up because they're fun, and who doesn't love a good turret? And porches, wrapped around porches, beautiful little things, and a lot more convoluted massing than there ever used to be, with all sorts of dormers and different things and a lot more fluff and all of the goodies, right? You can just do squiggly lines over your whole drawing and say, it's a Victorian house, just like that. But you can see that the massing gets more and more and more complex. Spanish Colonial Revival. This one's a really interesting one because you'll still have some of these very simple forms, low roof pitches. Oftentimes you'll get a very low slung flat tower in there somewhere, tiled roofs, arches in stucco, all sorts of stuff like that. And the volumes in these Spanish colonial revivals are a lot more flexible because almost all of that style is an asymmetrical design. There's very few that are bilaterally symmetrical. You'll have local symmetries, but you won't necessarily have those in the overall composition. Italianate. What you're doing with the Italianate styles, you're taking that essential colonial thing and you're just putting a whole bunch more fluff on that sucker. You have the Second Empire with those mansard roofs that are those super steep pitch ones with dormers in those, and super tall elongated porches and really tall windows with double arches and things. It's all the ones that you think look like haunted mansions, because that's at Disneyland what the haunted mansion is a Second Empire style thing. So that's how we equate it. Now, but they're all fairly simple, and there's different proportions that exist within the massing of each of these styles to help set the groundwork for how the decoration, the ornament, the details are articulated on each of these things. And here's how it matters to you. If, for instance, I want to do a Victorian style home, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do. However, you have to be keeping within the proportions of the Victorian style homes, meaning that if I have a parlor or a dining room and I want to have a bay and it's a beautiful little dining room over here, I need to stay within the dimensions that would have existed within the proportions of that system, meaning like probably 15 by 20 in terms of the maximum size of that particular room. And how do those rooms begin to associate with these other rooms? You have to look at, as you're composing these things, as volumetric and squares and pieces of squares put together so that you can roof this in some logical way. We will cover how to do this in other courses, but I'm just explaining right now why it's so important to understand that you start with the style first and the parameters of the style before you just start laying out a floor plan and then try to throw some ornament on it and call it an X, Y, or Z. Because that's not what happens. And that's why we live in an a-stylistic world. It's because that's where all we're doing is just designing. I've got a parlor, I've got an entry, and I've got a da-da-da-da-da, go down the list, and then I'm going to tack on some of these elements that exist within a certain style. But it's nothing, there's nothing related to that style at all. So here's another example. I want to do a colonial house. I get it all the time. All right, guess what? A colonial house, back in the day, if you live in Massachusetts or you're in the East Coast and you live in one of these houses, you know exactly how it's arranged, right? You're going to have a staircase here in the center, or you're going to have a central hall, and you're going to have two rooms. And then guess what? That's all your house is, unless you actually start putting all these appendages on either side and busting stuff out to the back, where you can actually start putting your kitchen and everything. And so you'd essentially have four rooms in these houses most frequently, until you get into a lot of those plantation homes down in the South where they could be squares and you still have that central corridor and central hall. However, you can begin to divide this up into a few more different sections. And so understanding the proportionality of this thing becomes absolutely critical to generate the actual stylistic authenticity that someone may be looking for. For instance, how wide do you think the front of this house can be if you're trying to do some sort of 5-bay colonial, if that's what you're interested in? It can't be really more than 50 feet, otherwise you're going from a 5-bay to a 7-bay. Between 40 feet, when you think about the overall heights and different things, it equates to a double square if you do a 40-foot and it's 20 feet tall. And then that is a really beautiful geometric proportion. And so understanding some of these fundamentals and volumetric applications really help you understand where you can and can't go stylistically. Because trust me, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I want to do a colonial, and this is what it looks like. And so then they'll give me a house that is like super, super, super wide, like this, right? And then here's my roof, and then here's my windows. And they'll have these big, giant, wide windows. And then they'll put a bunch of grids in it and say, that's a colonial house because I'm going to have 5 bays. No, it's going to be 3-bay colonial. But I'm going to just put all these windows. I'm going to put this big, giant door with 2 side lights and a little pediment thing on the top. and do the same thing over here. Well, guess what? That is nothing like what would be a 5-bay Colonial or a 3-bay or whatever. And this is where I'm really passionate, because our world continues to look the way it does because we don't understand some of the fundamental rules for each style. And once again, in this particular episode, we're not going to go into every single detail. That's what this whole Residential Design Academy is actually for, is to actually get into some of these things, and we have discussion groups and everything else to discuss the nuances of each of these things. So when people are coming to trying to design something more authentic, you can just say, hey, how do I do X, Y, or Z? There's going to be tons of people to give you information where best to look and how to actually approach it, where your pitfalls are going to be, right? Every single style has these things. I could go on and on and on. But let's go from massing, which is absolutely critical, to the elements. This is principle number 3. The elements of an individual style. The elements of a particular style generally derive from either vernacular architecture or high classic. And we could call it just fancy. That's what I'll do right here. Just fancy stuff, right? And so a vernacular architecture is going to be something that is just your everyday person house, meaning that the columns on my front porch are essentially just going to be timbers. It's just going to be a big timber column. A big fancy thing, I'm going to have a column that's a proportion after some classical order. I'm having a very difficult time drawing here, even though I do it all the time. And whatever the capital on this thing, whether it be Ionic, whether it be Corinthian or whatever, and whether it has fluting, not fluting, base, no base, etc., that will begin to determine the style in some sort of classical thing. But as you begin to put a capital and a base, that ups its overall fanciness, right? Because if I just have a timber and a beam, and that's just a wood timber, wood beam, it's very vernacular. And it's the easiest thing that you can do rather than sculpting a whole fancy column. And this is where it begins. And as we transition from vernacular to fancy, what ends up happening is, all right, let's put a column here, but now let's put a bracket on it. Okay, now let's put a base on this one. Okay, now let's chamfer the edges so it has a little bit more decoration. Okay, now let's actually begin to play with what the top looks like. Let's start putting on some capitals. Now let's actually sculpt something in there that in wood that actually represents what the building is that the capital is going on. And so the parts and the pieces of architecture, that capital, that top piece that actually holds the weight and bears the weight of those primary beams that hold up additional walls, that hold up roofs and all of those things, become one of the determining factors that actually help specify the language that you're beginning to speak. Now, when it goes to, say, a Victorian, rather than this very standard Tuscan order from classical architecture, which has a certain diameter at the base, and it's 7 or 8 diameters tall, depending on the proportioning system that you're using. The stuff that exists in the eaves gets even crazier. And understanding where you're at from a vernacular to fancy will help you understand what to apply. And so as we get to the last principle, details or elements. This is where we have an opportunity to go very, very right or very, very wrong. And it is the education of ourselves by our own deliberate effort to try to learn the details and the proper application of those details, which will generate a more authentic feel and vibe. So when we're talking about details, let's actually focus on one thing of the house, one part of the house, the porch, the front porch. If we have this big, long porch right here, on the one end, we can have what would be considered a traditional column with a capital on the top, a column that comes down to a base with its different articulated elements, and it would be traditionally proportioned, formed with a cornice on the top of it and all the goodies, right? So there would be a Tuscan or Doric order, if you've ever heard those words before. You can always watch the other courses for like the traditional languages and get an education on the classical orders of architecture to have a fundamental understanding of those. But as we continue to go down the line of some of these things, everything begins with the Renaissance. As we went back, looked into history thousands of years before, pulled open books, researched the Greeks, researched the Romans in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, back in Europe, and they revitalized the ancient architecture of the ancient Romans. And then we did variations on a theme with that. As we continued to do variations, we explored virtually everything you could possibly do with the column on a front porch, meaning Victorian age, super thin. And the reality is they would like chamfer the edges and do all sorts of things. And they would do these super high fancy brackets and fun stuff and about as much fluff as you could possibly put, really tall capitals. And it became a very elongated thing. And that looks like a smokestack coming out of a really poorly designed chimney. And then arts and crafts, right? So you'd have some sort of brick plinth or stone plinth that this tapered column would sit on top of. And that taper would exist in all sorts of different pitches and slopes and widths. But that taper was one of the primary indicators of that craftsman style when it came to details and elements, even though both of these styles still had the same relationship between the capital over here and what we call the architrave or primary beam that sits just above the capital. And so even though the articulation of all of this and the proportions of this, meaning the cornice, your primary beam, the architrave and frieze, and your actual post here, although these things varied tremendously from piece to piece to piece, style to style to style, they still existed from style to style to style. And understanding how they began to be articulated in the different styles is very important. And then a porch in, say, a Spanish colonial style. Oftentimes, they would also be using classical architecture, but oftentimes they'd just be using arches. So you'd have some really nice molding profile at this impost block, may or may not have keystones, come down to some sort of base or plinth down at the bottom, and that became a porch. And so each of these, slightly different in their articulation, all performing the exact same function, but everyone is different in their purpose and what they're trying to communicate or convey visually. When it came to modernist stuff, we got rid of all of the fluff and just went steel on steel. When it comes to vernacular architecture, it would just be timber on timber. But as we close this particular section, as we've talked about modern, transitional, traditional, as we've talked about some of the massing that goes into and generates the actual stylistic requirements, and as we've talked briefly about some of these details, and trust me, you can go endlessly into the depth of details, we need to keep in mind that quote, the idea from Vitruvius in the 10 Books on Architecture that was discovered and reapplied during the Renaissance 600 years ago, that in architecture, in home building, and all this stuff, we need to exercise what he calls decorum. Everything should be consistent within itself, and everything should be appropriate to what the thing is. Meaning, if I'm articulating a door to an outhouse, what does that begin to look like? If I'm articulating a door to a, let's say, the front door. If I'm articulating the door to an outhouse, that's one thing. If I'm articulating the door to your front, that's a totally different thing. If I put that little symbol on it, where do you know that goes? You know that goes to an outhouse, huh? If I begin to
if I begin to do something more like this, and I begin to fancy this up,
that's going to be a very different door, and it can get fancier and fancier and fancier. And as we wrap up this course, thanks for joining us, number one. We've discussed in the previous episode the fundamental principles of timelessness. And this one, we've looked at style, massing, modern to traditional, and some of those elements. However, we haven't gone deep dive. That's for conversation groups and what the Residential Design Academy is actually for. It's to create a community where we can all gather together and actually discuss the nuances of residential design just to make the world a more beautiful place. And we want you to join this community. Next time, what we're going to do is dive a little bit further into the elements, because what we have to understand is what generates authenticity. What generates that sense of place? What generates character? Join us on our next episode where we discuss character versus caricature. See you next time.